Final Fantasy VII begins and ends with a look into camera. It is a look that stretches across 30 plus hours of gameplay, and works as the boundaries within which a story of lost lives and ecological disaster unfolds. 23 years have passed since this character, Aeris, first looked at players of Final Fantasy VII in 1997. And with the remake now knocking on our plague-ridden doors, I want to focus on this look, to think about what looking into camera achieves in a video game, and ask what this look says about some of the main themes of Final Fantasy VII. And I can think of no better way to begin than by completely ignoring Final Fantasy VII and video games as a medium, and instead, looking to the cinema. Looking into the camera lens has a proud history in cinema, and it usually functions to violate the boundary between the audience and the film. This violation can appear in a number of ways. For instance, in Fight Club, Tyler Durden seems to destabilise the film reel itself when he looks into camera, violating the sanctity of the cinematic film strip and the audience's distance from the film. Alternatively, it might point to power, as in the French short film La Jetée, when the head scientist who has conducted cruel experiments on the protagonist asserts his authority through a look to camera. In the television show Fleabag, the main character treats the audience as her personal confidant. She confesses some of her most perverse desires to us and relays amusing anecdotes in order to draw us into her world and gain our trust. This makes the realization that she has not told us everything all the more violating and impactful as the comedy shifts into tragedy in light of this new information. In each of these examples, the violation comes from the breakdown of the wall between the audience and the image. No longer regarding the narrative at a safe distance, the audience is pulled into the world of the character, willingly or not. But as much as Final Fantasy VII borrows from the cinematic medium, it is not a film. Video games have a different language, and I'm not sure we can interpret Aeris' look to camera as a violation. We expect to be looked at in games, to be invited into a world. As we sit, cross-legged in front of a screen, controller in hand, and as Aeris looks at us, we are waiting to become part of her world. The look invites us, but what precisely is Aeris inviting us into? We can begin to unpack this question by considering Aeris' role in the game. Aeris is a bright spot on a planet that, like our own, is dying. She is associated with life based on her connection to the life force of the planet, called the life stream, and her name. Her name evokes a sense of the ethereal of the air we breathe. Aeris, air. An alternative translation of her name might be read as Aerith, earth. Aeris' name evokes ideas of life and the planet, centering many of the themes of Final Fantasy VII, and through her look, we are invited to consider how societies relate to ecological systems and life itself. Part of considering life is acknowledging death, and Aeris is tragically murdered midway through Final Fantasy VII. Death seems to cling to her, first her mother, then herself, and with her, the planet. Her death serves to bring notions of ecological disaster and death into the thematic centre of the game. The trauma of her death leads to a demand for justice on the part of the player. But if Aeris represents life and the planet, her death represents the death of the planet itself. Therefore, to seek justice, one must look to who is at fault in the game for the planetary disaster. Final Fantasy VII is clear that the fault of this planetary crisis lies directly at the feet of Shinra, the mega-wealthy corporation that runs the world of the game. Mirroring our own world, the ecological disaster threatening to destroy the planet is not the fault of the general population, but the result of the ruthless search for profit by corporate powers, and the exploitation of planetary resources by these powers. Shinra has built several power reactors that extract the energy of the planet called Mako energy, which has now led to the disaster facing the planet. In turn, this exploitation of planetary resources has led to exploitation of labour, and evidence of this is accounted again and again in the game, from the slums of Midgar to the villages desolated in Shinra's search for power. Here, the game connects ecological disaster to the ruthless exploitation that is characteristic of capitalism. The search for power that facilitates the planetary disaster is fueled by the oppression and exploitation of populations and their labour. The disaster the planet faces in Final Fantasy VII is not a distant threat, but one that is immediate, situated in the present. The same situation seems to be playing out in the real world. However, in the real world, many of us think about the threat of climate change as being situated in the future. We often like to imagine that, while things are bad now, the real threat is in the future and we have time to address it. This being in spite of all the evidence demonstrating that it is happening now. Final Fantasy VII rejects this ideological notion of futurity, of thinking about the ecological disaster as belonging to a distant future. Instead, the past and future are presented in the game as active agents in the present. Indeed, time is confusing in the game, with past, present and future often becoming mixed up. The look that begins and ends the game foregrounds this idea. When we first see Aeris, she appears in an abstract black space and the context of the scene only comes later. When we see her at the end of the game, she once again appears in an abstract black space, but this time no context is given. She cannot be there as she has already died, and yet she is here. We could argue that this is merely Aeris looking at us from the life stream, where the souls of the dead go in Final Fantasy VII, but this does not explain the striking similarities between the first and last looks. It seems as if the look at the beginning and end of the game are the same look, which makes it difficult to situate this final look within the timeline of the game. Does Aeris look at us from the present, future, or past? We cannot say. It isn't clear from where she is looking. With her look, past, present, and future are drawn together, no longer neatly separated. They are all immediate, here now, and urgent. We cannot address one without addressing the others. As Aeris is representative of so many of the game's themes, I want to suggest that this deliberate temporal confusion serves to create what Donna Haraway calls a thick present. Haraway elaborates her notion of the thick present in her book Staying with the Trouble. This book is about, among other things, environmental disaster and time. Like Final Fantasy VII, Haraway criticizes environmental activism that relies on saving a future that isn't here yet. She argues that this minimizes the extent to which environmental disaster is here already. Equally, it effaces what we can do right now to fight climate change. We often like to imagine that some technology company will invent some brilliant device that will avert the oncoming apocalypse and allow us to return to our normal lives. Not only does Haraway reject this reliance on mystical technology, she sees it as closing up the possibility of rethinking how we might live with each other and the planet, especially in the context of a political system that has led to corporate greed and environmental disaster. Rather than preserving a damaging and exploitative political system, Haraway argues that our task is to make trouble, to stir up potent response to devastating events, as well as to settle troubled waters and rebuild quiet places. Living in a thick present involves, on the one hand, acknowledging disasters, both environmental and political. On the other hand, living in a thick present means creating a space in which unexpected connections can form between life, community, peoples, and the planet that can face these disasters head on. Say, for instance, a group of strangers from disparate backgrounds banding together to tackle an emergency. These connections can be used to fight climate change and the economic powers that ensure poverty and ecological disaster remain unchallenged. Often, these unexpected connections that make up the thick present are between communities and peoples, but they can also be temporal connections. The thick present does not abandon the past and future. Instead, the past and future are drawn into the present and are understood as active agents in the present that are continuously under negotiation. Final Fantasy VII shows this kind of temporal relationship in the flashback sequence to Nibelheim. The sequence is repeated several times throughout Final Fantasy VII, with each time establishing a new relation between what has happened and what it means in the present. Here, the past is not some abstract memory that is unchangeable and distant from the present, but rather a zone of constant contestation that exerts power now. With the past having such power over the present, it is difficult to separate the past from the present. The past seems to belong to the present, creating a present thick with time and possibility. A thick present. Like Haraway, the main characters of Final Fantasy VII understand that the forces of economic power that run the world, that being capitalists, will not fight for us. The Shinra capitalists are too invested in profit that rely on systems of planetary and labour exploitation that are destroying the planet. Seeking salvation in these systems of old will not stop the planetary disaster. Shinra's plan ultimately fails because instead of living in a thick present in which they build unexpected connections, they rely on their old methods of exploitation that got the planet in this mess in the first place. This is demonstrated when Shinra attempt to use weaponry based on the technology that is draining the planet of its life force to solve the crisis the planet faces. Again and again, Shinra rely on extracting Mako energy to create new weapons to save the planet, with each attempt ending in failure. Indeed, it seems Shinra are more interested in gaining power than saving the planet. In fact, maintaining power, even at the expense of the planet, seems to be their highest goal, as is demonstrated when they attempt to execute the main characters instead of attempting to build new connections with them and learn from the knowledge they have gained in their journey. Once more, parallels emerge here between Shinra's response and that of our governments. Governments in our world consistently ignore the advice of scientists and experts on climate change, instead prioritizing the economy and the financial gain of corporate powers. Both Shinra, our own government, and the corporate powers of our world would rather face annihilation than change their ways. If we are to fight climate change, we must demand changes to our political system. We must find new ways to relate to each other and the planet that are not determined by a desire for profit. In other words, we must prioritize life, not the economy. Final Fantasy VII puts this premise directly into its core mechanics, and specifically the Materia system. Materia grants party members special abilities, such as spells or buffs to their stats. This allows the player to experiment with how each character behaves in combat, which has the knock-on effect of altering how the characters relate to one another. For instance, you might equip Cloud with defensive materia so he can cast spells to defend the party, while Tifa uses a death blow materia, coupled with added cut to rack up physical damage on bosses. Alternatively, you might throw all your magic materia on Tifa instead, letting Cloud do all the heavy hitting, while Barret uses the protect materia to tank for his allies. In effect, the materia system is a simple mechanic that allows for a number of complex relations to form between party members. Changing your materia is an experiment, finding ways for your party members to relate to one another, and using unexpected combinations to solve the challenges the party faces in their quest to protect the planet. This is all done within the boundaries of the thick present. Returning to the idea of the look that began this essay, we can say that this is the final function of Aeris' look to the player at the beginning and end of Final Fantasy VII. They are bookends that mark the boundaries of the thick present of this game. The connections the characters make to one another, to the people around them, and the physicality of the world itself enable them to beat Shinra and protect the planet. Final Fantasy VII asks us to act in this world, to think about this climate disaster by asking us to immerse ourselves in this thick present into which we are invited by Aeris' look. Through this, we can build connections and amplify the powers of individuals in the forms of communities of resistance. But this process is rarely clean. The characters of Final Fantasy VII make mistakes often. Indeed, Barret acknowledges this when he questions his own use of violence when he ordered Avalanche to blow up reactors. Many of the tactics that they use in Final Fantasy VII would not work in our own world. For one thing, I can't set things on fire with a magic ball of condensed spirit energy, nor would I recommend engaging in actual terrorism. But Final Fantasy VII is fictional. We're in reality and we require different tactics. But, like the characters of Final Fantasy VII, we must join together to think how we can save a planet that is not dying in some distant future, but right now, with all of us in it. We must think and live in a thick present. Thanks guys for making it to the end, and I hope you enjoyed. This was my first video and it's been a bit of a learning curve, but I'm ready to get stuck in and do some more, so do like and subscribe. The lessons from this video will hopefully improve my next video, which you'll be seeing in a few weeks, and it will be on Silent Hill 2, so see you then.